So just as a reminder, I'm not sure if you guys were here on the Tuesday class. I don't think that you guys were. Aldrich, I think you may have been. But on the modules, um, on the Tuesday class, I had gone over these review questions. So take a look at the video to go over that. I haven't put the test up just yet, but there'll be a test for this. It'll be a fairly simple, straightforward quiz, but all of the answers will be in that video for that, okay? So just as a reminder. And then also, go back to the modules for a second. So there's a copyright discussion that I'd mentioned in that video as well, but this is pretty straightforward. If you click on it, there are 3 videos for you to watch. If you watch over the videos and then just make one comment for each one of the videos, like what did you learn from the videos that you didn't know before, or you can make whatever comments you want, but that's mainly what I'm really looking for, is to see what you gained from it in terms of understanding copyright. And then we're moving into the portion of the course where I'm talking about print production. So we're a little bit behind, but I want you to take your visual identities that we've been creating and then apply them, first of all, for this next project, for print projects, print products. And then after that, I'll also have you convert them for screen, for doing things like, you could maybe do, like, for instance, an animated version of your logo. Or you could do a website. But for this next one, we're going to focus on print stuff. So if I go back to the modules for a second. I'd like to look at the progress you've been making on your projects. But before we do that, I'd like to go over the use of mockups in Photoshop. I've also added these links. So the first one is the various types of printing. It gives you a pretty concise description of these different types of printing. So graphic design actually as a term originally stems from, it basically means designing for print. That's the original intention of it. So that's not really what it is anymore, but that's where it sort of comes from. And a big portion of graphic design is based around print technology. So these days that may be less true than it was, 20 or 30 years ago, but certainly print technology is still a very important part of the process of becoming a designer and understanding the different types of printing. So when you're designing for print, you have to understand some of the limitations of the type of printing you're making files for. So for instance, there are different limitations for screen printing than there are for, say, gravure printing, or for digital printing, or for offset lithographic printing, and so on. So the main types of printing are surface printing, flexographic printing, screen printing, rotary screen, gravure printing, and digital printing. You also have what's more commonly called offset lithographic printing. So that's one link. And then the other one I put is a glossary of print production terminology. This is a lot to go through because it's an A, B through W, alphabetical order of all of the different terminology that relates to print technology. So, you don't really need to know all of these, but sometimes you'll come across terms for something and you're not really sure what people are talking about. Maybe you're reading something, And so this gives you a brief description of all of these different basic terminologies. So things like, in the review questions, I'd ask the question like, what is bleed, for instance? So bleed is something in printing where you need to have a little bit extra. When you first set up an InDesign file, you go to File, New Document. You'll see down here at the bottom on the right-hand side, there's a thing that says bleed, and then there's also bleed and slug. And in the area for bleed, you can specify how much space you want. The bleed, by the way, is almost always 1/8 of an inch, 0.125 inches, all the way around. And the bleed is just a little bit extra. So if I put 0.125 IN in here, this right now is set to picas and points. So it's going to convert this to 0 picas, 9 points. That's the same as 1/8 of an inch. And I'm going to leave the slug off. The slug would be an area where you would place information about the file. So for instance, if you're a design firm, you might put your own logo on that with some information like a phone number or contact information. So when they print out the job, if there's something they need to contact you about, they have it on the file itself. But the bleed is a more important thing. This is crucial. If you're doing stuff which prints right to the edge of the piece of paper, you need it to go over slightly. So this extra 1/8 of an inch is that red line around the outside in the InDesign document. This is where it's actually going to trim to, and this is the margin, which is a kind of area which would be used in terms of the structure, like the basic grid structure of the page. But it isn't crucial in many ways. This is the edge of the page, the black line, and the red line is the bleed. Same thing in Illustrator. So if you look at an Illustrator file, right now I have one that's open here that I'm going to use for this print production demo. I've set this file up where it's using spot colors, first of all. So these are Pantone colors. In Illustrator, you can select these by going to this pull down on the side of the swatches panel, and you can choose color books, and then you can choose from various color books. Pantone is by far and away the most commonly used color matching system. So Pantone solid coated would be probably the most common book. So if you loaded that, this is actually a physical book that you can purchase. And so you can check what the color will actually look like once it's printed. So on this one, for instance, if I click on it, you can see if I leave my cursor over this color, it's called Pantone Yellow C. This one is called Pantone 102C. If I click on this, it's this color right here, and if I put my cursor over it, it's Pantone 711C. So if you had a Pantone book, which looks like this, I should have brought my Pantone books in to show you, but I'll bring them in next week. But they're basically like this. It's like a fan of a set of colors. Each one is printed as an individual ink color, so that's why they're pretty expensive, these books. You can see that for this set of 2 books, it's $378. They're pretty expensive because each color is a separate run through the press, so there's thousands of runs through the press to make that book. And obviously they're doing a lot at the same time, but it's still a kind of expensive process to create that. And but this is the way that in the print industry we match colors. So these ones are going from coated to uncoated, and it's a bridge book. That means that you can see what the CMYK breakdown would be for that Pantone color. So whilst I'm talking about this, somebody explain to me what I mean by a spot color. All 3 of these colors are spot colors. What does that mean? A spot color is like an individual ink color. So the printer would go to his shelf, or maybe he has to order it. He'd get that particular ink, Pantone 371. It might actually be that the printer has to mix that out of 2 different, so he'd have a formula guide for mixing those inks to make that ink, but it's an actual ink he's printing with. Whereas usually a lot of printing is done using CMYK, as you probably know, which is a mixture of dots. So this yellow in CMYK, if I was to convert this to CMYK, would actually come out on 3 different separation plates. It would come out on the cyan plate, the magenta plate, and the black plate. Only a little tiny bit on cyan, only a little bit on magenta, but all of the yellow would be a solid black. But if you would print this as a spot color, it all comes on one separation. So I'd meant to set up the reason I was kind of playing around at the beginning of the class as well as hoping to create is color separations for you out of the printer, but I couldn't get the printer to work. So I've done a sort of workaround where I can show you how they separate. So if I save this Illustrator file and I place this into InDesign, so I have one set up here. This is the Illustrator file placed into here. If I then go to File Print, I'm not actually going to print it because we don't have a printer set up, but I'm going to send it to the printer as a PostScript file. So I'm printing a file in effect. And then this is my workaround. Let me show you these little features. So in here, I'm also going to change where it says marks and bleed. I'm going to set all of the marks on. I'm also going to set it so that it shows it uses the document bleed settings. So this little bit extra, it's going to show that, as well as the part inside where it trims to. And then under output, I've changed it so that it is actually based off of a printer, because otherwise, if I put it as device independent, it won't let me do color separations. So I'm choosing this particular printer, even though I'm not printing to that. And then under here where it says color, instead of composite RGB, I'm going to change it to separations. So right down here, you can see the separations it's going to print. It's going to print the Pantone 2995, Pantone Yellow C, Pantone 71C. All of these process colors, you'll notice, don't have the printer icon next to them. So it's not actually going to print these. The LPI right now is set to 70. Normally the default for printing color would be 150. But let's say this was outputting for a t-shirt, which would be quite likely if you're doing 3 spot colors. It might be some kind of screen printing. Then you would want to have a lower lines print. Probably not 150, but maybe more like 85, something like that. So LPI, I think I'd mentioned this to you before, it's the space between dots in a halftone screen. So this is what a halftone screen looks like. It's those dots that make up a printed image. So this is what a halftone screen looks like. The LPI is the measurement of those rows of dots. So 150 LPI is pretty standard for offset lithography. So if you're printing book covers, things like that, it's probably printing at 150 LPI. Newspapers generally print at a lower LPI, maybe more like somewhere between 85 and 120. Which means that you could use lower resolution images and it wouldn't really make any difference because they can't contain that much detail. So when I'm creating these color separations, these are actually going to separate as solid colors because they're going to print as one particular color, not percentages of magenta, yellow, black. So it doesn't need to be created out of dots. So I could select the image in the Illustrator file, and if I go to color, you'll notice that in the color slider for this particular color, that there's only one slider. So that's our separation plate. We could lower the opacity on it, and this would then print as dots onto the white paper. That's why you'd get like a lighter version of it. Rather than it being solid all across the page, it would just be little dots of it. So that's the halftone screen. So this is the separation that I created from that. Let me see. So if I go to the desktop, I think I put this into my folder. I had to try it a few times to get this to work because it's not really normally how you would do separations. But this is what these separation plates look like. You'll notice that everything is black because the way that these plates are used is that they represent the particular space that needs to be printed, right? In Illustrator, by the way, everything by default knocks out. So you'll notice that this color, which on the original file is this blue color, on the separation plate has a hole in it. That's because this other color needs to print onto white paper. So we go back to the artwork again. The yellow also has a hole out of it for the red to fit into. So there is a setting in here for trapping. So you could use application built in. Or if you were using a rip separation, which is right here, in rip separation, you could choose that. But if you were doing this for screen printing, you wouldn't need to trap it. These days, very rarely would you as a graphic designer, if you're working as a graphic designer, ever trap files. These days it's always done at the point of print production when you send the file out to be printed. In the print shop, they would have like a pre-flight software, what it's called a pre-flight software, which prepares the files. It checks the files, makes sure everything is going to work when it prints, and they can call out, they can find errors in it and so on, and it will also do the trapping. Trapping is basically this process. If you were doing it in Illustrator, because I used to do this in the early days of digital graphics, you'd have to trap your own files. I would put a stroke around the outside of this shape, and then in the attributes panel, I would go to overprint stroke, and this stroke would have to be a very small amount, usually like 0.1 0.25 of a point, something like that. It's very small. So basically what it's doing is it's slightly overlapping on the edge of the blue. If you were to look at these separations, this shape would be slightly bigger than that hole. Very, very slightly. So that if there's some misregistration, you don't get a white gap between them. Okay. So like I said, as a graphic designer, you don't really have to worry about that too much these days. It's kind of taken care of you. When you send the job out to get it printed, it will automatically trap it. So you don't necessarily need to know any of this print production stuff in detail to be a good graphic designer. But it is useful because you're going to need to talk to printers possibly. When you've got a job that you're going to get it printed, you should talk to a couple of different printers and get estimates for the job. And then when you come to send the job to the printer, I would have a conversation with them, find out how they want it set up. So for one example would be, for instance, I'd mentioned to you before about a 4-color black. 4-color blacks on some presses you would want more than on other. There's also what's called a print tolerance. So the amount of, in CMYK, the amount of percentages combined together. So if you had like 100% magenta, 100% black, 100% yellow, 100% cyan, it'd be too much ink on the page and it starts to get all blobby. So there is usually it's around 250%. This depends a little bit on the press, but it's around about 250%. So you could ask questions like that of the printer, like how far can I push? What's the highest percentage I can go in terms of the tolerance? And that's true both in Photoshop files, in Illustrator files, or what have you. Those are some considerations to think about. So I also wanted to go over, like I said, using these mock-ups for creating your graphics for your visual identity project. So this is a file that I downloaded. I have given you some links for different websites where you can access these, but if you go to Mr. Mockup, for instance, some of these mockups, in fact a lot of these mockups, you have to pay for, but they do have a section on here of freebies. So you may be able to find what you need for free. Some of them might be really cheap, like a couple of dollars or something. But if I go under the freebies section, I can see what I have available. And you have quite a few things that you could choose from for working on this idea, I think. So phone with case mock-up, for instance, a square frame. This one's on a mug. This one's on a poster. So like if you design a poster, for instance, this is a good way to show it. If you put it into the context of how the poster will look, it'll make it feel more professional in a portfolio. So you may show the poster by itself, but also show it like giving it in a context. So if I go to freebies and then search, I can also find particular things. I think I found this. I think this one's free, so let's download this one. So when you download the file, if I go to Show in Finder, if it's a mock-up like this, usually it downloads as a zipped file. So that's a compressed file. It might be a folder actually with more than one file inside of it. And then once it's finished downloading, you can double click on it. So here's one that I've downloaded before. If I double click on it, now I have a folder of images. I'm just going to put this one onto my desktop. So this is the actual Photoshop file. There's a little documentation to help you use the file as well, to show you how it works. And there's a licensing agreement, so it tells you how you can use this file legally. All our freebies are royalty-free for use in both personal and commercial projects, so we really don't have to worry about it. And then if I double-click to open this in Photoshop, you'll see in most of these files, they'll have a layer which is a smart object layer like this that usually has a description that says something like your image here. It might not necessarily be like that. I've downloaded ones before where they're in Korean or something like that. But you can usually get the idea if you open it up. Like here, the label is obviously in the bottle. The layers are organized pretty clearly. So this is the bottle. If I open up that group, in here I've got the smart object layer. So if I click on this, I'm going to turn this one off, and I'm going to go back to Illustrator, and I'll bring in my graphic. So if I wanted to bring this in and use it on there, I can select this graphic, copy it, go back into here, paste it. If I paste it as a smart object, it'll still be linked back to the Illustrator file. So if I want to go back to the Illustrator file later on and make changes to it, I can. So I press OK here. I'll change this position a little bit. Yeah.
Making it a smart object also makes it like so kind of blends in with the background, right? So like there's like when you sort of the jersey, like if there's like a wrinkle in the jersey, making a smart object.
Yeah, it can do. So it depends on how it's set up. But yeah, like so the ones, if I save this on this one, let me see what it's doing. It might be bending it very slightly, but you can see it's picking up some of the texture of the bottle underneath. So they have some stuff over the top, like these lighting effects. And this shadow here. So those are sitting over the top of the label. So the label itself is actually pure white. But when you get into here, it's being affected by that because of the stuff which is above it. So a lot of those, they might even be distorted to bend around something, for instance, in the file. And when you double click on it and open up, you'll still place your flat version of your logo in there, or whatever graphic you're bringing in. On this one as well, if I wanted to change the color of the bottle, it's got this change bottle color layer. So if all I have to do is double click on it, and I could change the color of it. So if I eyedropper my orange color, which is part of my visual identity, I'm actually going to cheat that a little bit so it looks more like it. But it makes it very easy for you to have something which really looks like it's a real product shot, or pretty close to a real product shot, fairly quickly by starting with one of these. You could make any file, any image into a mock-up for yourself by doing the work that's been done in this to set it up, so that if you use that kind of mock-up in the future, you have it already set up. But there are lots already available for you. So if it's something that works for you, you can modify them in a variety of different ways, obviously. Like on this one, for instance, I've added these. This one's got two bottles, which I kind of like because I can show the front and the back. So this is supposedly showing the front and the back of this bottle. But again, I could go in and I could change the background on it to something completely different. This one comes in with this kind of very simple gray gradient of a background. But we could change it to whatever we like and add that in. Here again, the file is organized in pretty much the same way. I've got bottle version 2 and bottle version 1. And if I open it up, again, I have that smart object layer, which I can double click on. And then I can go in here and change the information on here pretty easily. This one I've placed as a vector smart object. So if I double click on it, I'm back into my Illustrator file. Maybe I want to change this so that this is a lighter version of that font. And then I can save this. This updates in here. If I then save this one, which is the Photoshop file that I jumped from the original one, now it's updated in this one. Do you all follow that okay? Okay, so that's sort of the next step in your visual identity, is putting stuff together which you can use to show off how the visual identity is used, once you've sort of defined what the visual identity is. The other thing I wanted to point out is that, maybe this is obvious, but as you're working on this, I know that these are sort of 4 distinct projects. You've got the logo, and then you have the visual identity guide that you've created, then you've got the print things, but remember these all bleed together. So if you want to go back and keep working on the logo even afterwards, you can still do that. But keep in mind that if you keep it editable, like I was doing there, where you place it as a vector smart object, it'll make it easier for you later on to go back and update elements. So now, for instance, I could go into this file in InDesign. I'll go to my Pages panel. I need an extra page at the bottom. So I'll go to my Pages panel and click on the new page icon at the bottom. And then I can place the file that I've just done. So I'm going to do Command D. I'll go into the links. Now I've got this water bottle mock-up. I think this is the right one. Let me show this as columns so I can see. Yeah, there we go. So now if I place this on the page, we have another page in the visual identity. So this is the idea, is that we start showing how I actually utilize it. And when you start showing it in these different contexts, you might find that you run into certain issues with the logo. Maybe it's certain sizes, it doesn't really work very well, or there's some sort of limitations to it, or maybe the color system that you're using you feel could use improved. Because once you start applying it to other elements, you'll find things out about it that you may not have thought about when you're just designing it initially. So that's one of the reasons why I have this, where it sort of continues, that you can kind of go back and keep improving it. All right. All right, I'm going to come around and see how you guys are getting on. I'll stop